Welcome to the first Bartlett School of Planning public lecture for this year. I'm not Nick Gallant, who usually hosts these. Unfortunately, Nick's unwell and sends his apologies. I'm Ben Clifford, Professor of Spatial Planning here at the BSP. Our public lecture series, which has been running for about 15 years now, brings leading researchers and practitioners on topics related to planning and the built environment before an audience of colleagues, students, guests. Our speaker this evening is Professor Gavin Parker. Gavin is Professor of Planning Studies at the University of Reading. He's been conducting research on planning at the community scale for 20 years and has been focused on neighbourhood planning, in Nick's words, since it became a thing. As well as being a prolific author on these topics, he maintains a range of connections outside of the university sector. He was an executive director at the RTPI from 2012 to 2014 with oversight of the education brief. He's vice chair of Action with Communities in rural England, and until recently was also chair of the New Forest National Park Authority. Gavin's insights into community level and neighbourhood planning draw on both his research and these involvements with the university sector. The subject of his lecture tonight is Neighbourhoods in Planning, Times Past, Lost and Future. There'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. So Gavin, over to you.
Given the title, the advertised title, you might imagine that I was asked by Nick to speak broadly about neighbourhoods, and I've largely stuck to that brief. But you'll hear as I go through that I wanted to contextualise some of the work that I've done past and currently with my kind of concern for justice and equity in planning and justice and equity at planning specifically at the neighbourhood scale. Particularly in and amongst a situation where we find ourselves mired, in a sense, with a whole raft of modulating factors that you could cast as being part and parcel of both the politics of planning as well as planning politics. And I'm going to return to that right towards the end to explain and unpack that a little bit more. So, you know, on first airing, that may not mean much, but I've elected to kind of do this in this way to kind of underline the delicate position I think planning is generally in, and specifically the delicate position I think planning is in relation to neighbourhoods now in 2025, but also potentially where we may be in 3.5 years' time, if you can do your electoral maths. So by way of an aside, and before I get too stuck into this, and Ben won't necessarily know this, I thought I should confide, really. I don't know how many of you in the room are current. Put your hands up. Are you a current UCL student, postgraduate, undergraduate? Okay, well, you'll see on the slide there, that was me here 35 years ago, almost exactly to the day. And I thought I was the bee's knees with a goatee and a leather jacket, and I was prepared to take on the world. And some of the lecturers at UCL at the time probably wished I was maybe a little less set on that kind of path, but that's another story. Mike Edwards may not ever remember this, but I was a student who attempted to lead a walkout on the basis that we should be, instead of being in the class, on the front lines protesting against the first Gulf War, hence the Gulf War slide as well. Mike may not remember that. It's a long, long time ago for both of us. But again, another occasion where another professor at UCL balks when I start talking to them. So maybe there's something in that. But you know, I wanted to just say that because you know it's been a long time kind of coming back to do a talk like this at UCL. I've never actually come back to UCL to do a lecture, so to speak. I've been, you know, in the department a number of times, and there are colleagues and friends in the audience that I've worked with, written with. So when I first enrolled as a planning student, I had little or no kind of conception really of what planning was really all about. Certainly had no conception of the various conflicts, actors, different scales even that planning is played out at. And I thought when I first came in that I was going to be more interested in strategic planning. And I can remember, you know, being quite, how can I say, quite rude to a few people who expressed an interest in other things. You know, strategic planning is everything, and here we are again. Strategic planning is now supposedly coming around again. But it wasn't very long into my time at UCL and at Bartlett that I realised that actually the action really is about people, and it's about the kind of conflicts and the way in which we're supposed to be doing things, not just for places, but really for people in the end. A very simple kind of idea, really. So after many years of being very fortunate to pursue lots of things that have really interested me and have spun out from that initial kind of spark of interest that I found kind of learning with people like Mike at the time, I've realised that a lot of the kinds of projects and different roles that I've undertaken over the years have ended up centering on questions of equity and defensibility of process as much as outcome. But I think the two are intrinsically linked together. And I think that my enthusiasm for what I'm doing hasn't really dulled. But I must say that I'm pretty dissatisfied with where we are right now, and I'm going to be talking a bit about that as we go on through. Dissatisfied for a number of reasons. First, with the kind of what seems to be a narrowing of the limits of acceptability and the kind of apparent acquiescence of our leaders and their various attempts to, I've put down here, creatively exclude us as much as include. And I think this very latest round, and you know, I don't know where we are with what round of planning reforms we might be. Today's round, the round of amendments that we're all hearing about, or the reforms from just a few years ago didn't go anywhere, or the planning infrastructure bill, or the Devo bill, or the way in which neighbourhood planning, I'll talk about at the moment, the funding has been cut. I mean, there are lots and lots of issues that seem to be directed at either denying or otherwise displacing people, and ignoring or attempting also to simplify where we know that the issues and the matters at hand for planning are messy, complex, and, well, frankly, all the more interesting for that. So, despite that, I do think there are people around, and I'd like to kind of also say that there are lots of people here at the Bartlett who are, forming an important part of a research culture, I think, who are prepared to speak out and push back against policy and against some of the rhetoric that we've been regaled with, certainly in the past few years, and I think we do need more of that. So that's what I wanted to say, just by way of a kind of a very early kind of intro. No idea how we go. No, that's backwards. I'll move in to talk a bit about neighbourhoods now. But neighbourhoods also in terms of the politics as we go on through the whole talk. So, unsurprisingly, I think scale does matter. And I think that, as I'm going to argue, the scale of neighbourhood really matters. And I think it really matters because, in a sense, that's where outcomes are felt most keenly. But also, as I'll come on to speak about later, it's also where dissent and populist attitudes ferment and become apparent and highly damaging. And my argument I'm going to make, counter to other people who've been writing about, right-wing populism, is that I think planning has an important role to play in helping to counter or even assist us in helping to mitigate, at least, or help to redress some of the damage and the possible ramifications of the move towards the right. So, as many of you here will recognise, and despite what I've just said, efforts to mobilise local people and to plan for their own neighbourhoods has quite a long history in this country. It stretches well back beyond the bounds of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to stick to around about 20 years worth of history in the kind of past section here. And I think that's probably enough for what is supposed to be a 40 to 45 minute talk. And I want to kind of talk a bit about some of the more recent formulations as well, and some of the statutory and non-statutory kind of experiments in terms of neighbourhood planning that we've seen. Because I think that some of those kind of experimental forays that stretch back even before 2000, but I'm going to stick broadly to that kind of range, have left us with quite an interesting store of experience and considerable evidence. There's a legacy also of unresolved issues, but at the moment we seem to be in a position where we're overseen by government who don't really want to necessarily learn from the lessons, and certainly from the kind of evidence that academics over the past, say, 20 years or so have been producing and offering up, albeit sometimes in peer-reviewed academic journals. But I think a lot of people in this room, and myself included, have also made some pretty, decent efforts to try to meet policymakers and politicians halfway and produce material that is more accessible, that should make a difference. And I'm a little bit disappointed, as I'll say later, that in particular neighbourhood planning seems to be sidelined in current thinking. But I've got reasons for saying that, because I'm not arguing that neighbourhood planning as we've experienced it post-2011 has been an unqualified success. Quite the opposite, because I'm going to focus in, as we talk, about planning at scale for neighbourhoods in disadvantaged or deprived areas. And I think that in many ways neighbourhood planning has been well, it would be too much to say a disaster. It's just been a non-event in many of those areas, and I'm going to come to that in a while. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the precursors also to neighbourhood planning as we've seen it post-2011, talking about parish plans, which were then for a while rebadged as community-led plans as a kind of last-ditch attempt to try to save them from reforms that were introduced then in 2010, if some of you in the room will remember, wide-scale changes to planning and to wider kind of regeneration and renewal policy at that time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of play into several projects that I've researched without necessarily going into too much detail of all of those projects, to delve back into some of the key kinds of findings and thoughts that are derived from that work that stretches back over that period, as well as bringing us more or less up to where we are now with a piece of research that we're doing called Just Neighbourhoods. I'm forgetting to use all my slides, I think, but let's see. Yeah. So some of the projects I want to talk about include not only how neighbourhood planning or similar tools have been taken up in disadvantaged areas, but also other work that is ongoing and I've been doing, including with people like Mark Dobson that's in the room, on time, but also ongoing work with organisations like the Community Planning Alliance, who some of you may be aware of in the room. It's basically a network of 600 to 800 campaign groups. We're doing some work at the moment to try to understand exactly who those groups are, what's motivating them, and how they are, how they're organising themselves and on what basis. So I think the institutional landscape, and indeed what Mark and I have called the timescape for planning, has been shifting and increasingly neoliberalised, so that a kind of dominant neoliberal policy frame and appropriation of issues has come to the fore, and the culture wars are really not helping in this regard, creating a situation where some of the most mundane or seemingly commonsensical planning ideas and concepts are being politicised and used in divisive ways. And indeed, that's kind of where I'm going to head towards the end of this talk, about how and why a deepening and a redoubling of efforts at neighbourhood scale to address and to engage communities, I think is part of a way out of where we are at the moment, rather than something that we should be avoiding. So let's start then with the idea of the neighbourhood. I'm not going to unpack this too much. Lots of people have written about this rather slippery concept. You know, is it something that we can define simply by boundary? Is it something that is an idea or is felt by individuals? There are lots and lots of different arguments there. I'm not going to go into that. Similarly with the concept of community. But in a recent article that was only just out just a few days ago, that Sue Brownhill put together with Andy Inch and Hugh Ellis, they themselves also came to the conclusion that this idea of community and community scale for planning is an incredibly difficult idea and very difficult to define with any certainty. So I'm going to leave it a bit open. But we do know that certainly when it comes to neighbourhood planning, formal neighbourhood planning, certainly in urban areas, there was a whole tussle over how neighbourhoods themselves were kind of forced to try to self-define their boundaries or co-produce their boundaries with others. And of course, in more rural areas, it was a fairly simplistic kind of adoption of historic, parish kind of boundaries. So, despite avoiding that difficult one of trying to define all of this, it is important that we recognise that what actually happens at scale really does matter to people. What is actually recorded and inscribed as policy, and what kind of priorities get set really do matter. They matter to people as part of the process of planning at scale, but also, as I'll argue in a moment, without that act of inscription, how can we possibly expect policies and key issues that relate to social justice to actually be pursued upscale? So I'll come to that. So, missing a little bit out because I think I'll overrun otherwise. This isn't working as well as I thought. This is going to go much, much slower, so you're going to start rebelling at some point. So it's hardly news that that neighbourhoods are diverse and contested, and that they diverge. Okay, but for much of my time since 2011, one of my main kind of active research themes has been formal neighbourhood planning. But before that, I was looking at community-led planning activity that was, I think, a bit more genuinely community-led, or at least a bit more generally co-produced, and it's got a bit forgotten, and I want to bring that back into our kind of into our scope of analysis here in 2025. So I want to talk in a moment about parish planning, and it sounds really quaint. But I think there's something in it that we've pushed out of the equation, because parish planning was a far more open exercise. It didn't immediately close people into thinking about either housing or growth. Issues that were relevant to people at that scale were all able to be reckoned with. And what it tended to do was push people towards a more kind of MIMBY space. A really important kind of thing, given where we are at the moment, and this supposedly new acronym that's been coined just in the past year or so of maybe in my backyard. What we were finding through parish planning is that the very process of getting involved and understanding better one's own neighbourhood, developing evidence about one's own neighbourhood, started to shift people's attitudes about what was necessary, what was possible, what was needed. And that wasn't only, and this is the kind of, I suppose, the headline kind of news from all that work, it wasn't about people saying no to things or insisting on only heritage or green space type issues to be put forward. There was some really strong evidence that people were starting to realise and make linkages about loss of services, need for affordable housing and so on, because the process was enabling people and giving them time. And there's that theme that I'm not going to talk about tonight, but easily could do a lecture just on time. I've been doing a lot of work on that recently. The time and space to deliberate and think. And other things that Mark and I have done, which is not, again, the focus of today, puts it that without time and space to think and deliberate, what actually is planning itself, let alone the kind of exercise and focus that I'm talking about now through things like parish planning. Now, parish planning was started in 2000, if you're not aware, and it was ushered in under the auspices of the 2000 Rural White Paper. So it was very much a rural activity. And I think this is why it's escaped the gaze of a lot of people who otherwise would work in urban planning or urban governance areas. But I got really interested in it. I got very, very interested in it, and I started working on it, and did some work for government. And then the report that offered up some of the evidence I'm just talking about. Now, see if you older people in the room, particularly, see if you get this date. That report was actually published in May 2010, and so it just completely, talk about Overton windows, and it completely didn't, it just disappeared in a black hole. And we looked at, hundreds and hundreds of parish plans and mapped the content and interviewed people and came to this view that they were really starting to change people's minds. And it was because of the community development aspect that was really aiding things. So there is a theme here that I can't deny about time and about, a narrative that's counter to where we are now with, I'm completely off script, by the way, never mind. Completely counter to Project Speed, completely counter to the kind of rhetoric we've been hearing, not just through this year and a half with the Keir Starmer government, but previous governments, that we just need everything to be quicker. And I think that most of us would agree that delay, if it's unnecessary or unproductive, is a problem. I think that's fairly obvious. But if actually it takes a certain amount of time to do a job well, right, or the planning itself is highly complex, and there are lots of different actors and decisions involved, then I think we need to start more widely pushing back as a collective about Project Speed. So that's not in this speech, by the way, so forget all of that. But in terms of, back to the script, in terms of this kind of community planning, this parish planning work, the ambit was open for people. There wasn't a limit on what people could talk about, and there wasn't a time limit on production of a plan, but they were done efficiently. They were done very cheaply as well. There were lots and lots of interesting lessons, I think, still to be reprised and brought back into current policy thinking about how and on what basis we look at neighbourhoods and neighbourhood renewal type activity that's being ushered through the current offering around plan for neighbourhoods and so on. So where am I? So I'm basically asking some kind of basic questions here about what can we actually draw from things like parish planning in the here and now, because really as an exercise it was about research, something that a lot of people in the room would understand is important, but applied research, and a research that was very much in the vein of what you would say is citizen science now, before the label of citizen science existed. And I think that drawing down on and using these types of labels in parallel with where we're headed now in terms of planning at neighbourhood scale or thinking about resource needs and issues and priorities at that scale, I think all this kind of stuff is useful to us. So what, if any of you, I don't know if any of you actually ever read a parish plan or seen a parish plan, but as they developed, they went through their own kind of genesis, their own evolution, if you like, and the kind of later stage parish plans were actually setting action agendas, and they were saying, this is what the parish needs to do, this is what health authority needs to do, this is what the education authority might need to do, this is what the local authority, they're offering up not just a high quality, relatively high quality evidence base at the very local level, but they're making those connections to what actions might need to be taken. And I think that's also important because it's a theme that I've got, in here, which is how do we work out vertical linkage and bottom-up linkage into policies and strategies that we develop. In what sense do we ever think about what evidence can be collected and should be collected at a very local scale and by actors other than either private consultants and local planning officers, and whether or not, on what basis that kind of evidence should be fed up into, say, local plan production. So I think there's a whole question there about what kind of evidence and how evidence is collected and on what basis and how it gets sorted. Let me just go on. I'm one behind, so there we are. So this was the report that came out in May 2010, and we did a little TCPA paper on the back of it at the time. So if you don't want to dig back, I think it came out at the very beginning of 2012 from memory. So when I was referring to citizen science and the idea that we could return to that, there's also some interesting kind of research by people like Newman, who have more recently kind of gone back into that space, and some interesting evidence there about how citizen science in the environmental side can certainly start changing people's attitudes. So I think building up and outwards from this. There is this evidence base that doesn't just rely on what I was doing, 20 odd years ago or whatever. So one of the things that I think parish planning and community-led planning, as it was then rebadged, did also was start to encourage people in rural areas at least, into thinking about affordable housing and social housing needs, which has been a fairly kind of difficult and somewhat intractable issue in many rural areas. And indeed, this theme of justice that I'm going to pick up on shortly, it also helps us potentially secure the ground for an understanding for the relationship between those types of tangible kind of goods and outcomes via planning policy and decisions, such as social housing, and how they are, in a sense, very obvious manifestations of sticking to a kind of a social justice agenda, and it's become all too easy for affordable housing and social housing to be squeezed out of the conversation of decisions. And I think my argument is if those kinds of policies rooted in social justice credentials were wired in at the very local scale, and they had influence back up into local plan, and it was more keenly reminded and pressed on people that is the social dimension of the sustainable development agenda, then we might have a better chance of keeping social housing and affordable housing in the equation, despite what I'm kind of calling the kind of viral influence of development viability assessments, which I personally think should be removed from our planning system. And that of itself shows you how far we've moved, that for some people that might sound like a controversial statement, because when they were first introduced in 2012, they were supposed to be a temporary measure to help unblock the housing market just after the global financial crisis. So anyway, I've taken probably too long talking about parish planning, but I did want to take this opportunity to kind of drag back from the past an exercise in wider evidence gathering and agenda setting that didn't have the kinds of limitations and parameters imposed on it that neighbourhood planning post-2011 did, both in terms of process and scope, and the ability then for others to pick up on what was being said across the board, not only in terms of land use planning. Okay, so I think we've missed a trick with neighbourhood planning, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. I mean, at the time when neighbourhood planning was first, introduced post 2011, or in fact, pilots were just before 2011, but let's use 2011 as our start point. There was some optimism about neighbourhood planning, that the promise of neighbourhood planning and that the rhetoric from government about neighbourhood planning was very much in the vein of, community-led. And if you remember the taking back control line, which actually has come back several times over since, and back then had a slightly less dark connotation. But I think the taking back control phrase now has taken on a somewhat darker phrase, and I think we should be mindful of that. And there are some people now writing about whether or not public participation generally in planning is now something that is tenable, given the rise of populist kind of sentiment and rhetoric. And I think there is definitely something in that, and it means that how we go about planning and participatory planning does need some careful thought, and we do need to think about that in that context of the politics of planning. Okay, so as I said already, definitely the formulation of MP post 2011 lacked a kind of community development component. Communities are expected just to start planning for growth and start planning pretty much for housing. And if they did other things, then that was supposedly, okay, you can do that, but as long as you're pro-growth and as long as you pretty much think about housing or don't block housing, okay? And I think it was entirely the wrong start point for communities. And I think it's led to some real difficulties with the way in which neighbourhood plans have orientated themselves. Now, I'm having to generalise here because I know there are some people in the audience that I recognise and I know well who've been working with communities on neighbourhood plans, and we know that there are some good examples and some more progressive examples. But out of about 2,800 or so neighbourhoods who have started a neighbourhood plan over time, first of all, only about half of them ever finished. Yeah. And the work that we've been doing on neighbourhood planning and related in disadvantaged areas, not just in England but elsewhere, but in England I'll stick to for the moment. Have a guess. Let's have a little game, shall we? Some of you may have read stuff I've done, so that'll be that'll be a shame. We'll spoil the game at least. Out of that 1,300 or so neighbourhood plans that have been finished, how many do you think have been completed in top 20% IMD in England? Anybody? 46. Yeah? So a tiny, tiny proportion. And that's the ones that have managed to finish. Okay? The work we've done recently on Just Neighbourhoods, the Just Neighbourhoods project, has also gone a bit further and started to look at what they're actually saying, given the context of these plans. And only 11 of those 46 are really saying anything that you would regard as having a social justice agenda associated to it, or citing their own condition of deprivation. And so we've been operating with neighbourhood planning as the primary kind of institutional tool or policy for planning at neighbourhood scale that I feel has been inappropriate for A, communities and community action, and B, forcing people into a narrow frame, okay, and a process of kind of re-scripting has been taking place. That for many of the areas in more deprived neighbourhoods, let alone the mainstream and the majority of neighbourhood plans being produced in more affluent areas, the content itself has been kind of cleaned out. And I think that is a normative bad anyway, but I also think it's absolutely missed a huge amount of really important, possible important evidence and material that local authorities and others, central government even, should have been regarding as a positive and very valuable source of understanding and evidence from below, from the bottom up. So I think we've really kind of missed a trick there. So I'm gonna ruthlessly cut out the bit about place planning and local place planning in Wales and Scotland, and hopefully, standing here in London, I can get away with it. But what I was really going to say is that we don't really know enough yet about how those formulations have worked, but we are looking at those as part of the project Just Neighbourhoods that I want to talk about now. And I'm kind of riding roughshod over what's supposed to be my accompanying slides. So I'm going to talk about Just Neighbourhoods now and the work that's ongoing. So we're focusing in on areas that are objectively assessed as deprived. So this is work that really derives from the previous iterations of research I've done on neighbourhood planning. I wanted to do work that specifically tried to understand what has been happening in more deprived neighbourhoods in relation to neighbourhood planning. Or both asking the question, why is neighbourhood planning not being taken up within those areas? Now, I think we could probably guess, we could speculate about that, but I thought, no, we need to go in properly and have a look, because that's the more effective way to get policymakers to pay attention, actually provide evidence, should we say, that theme again. But also to try to understand what was going on and why plans were produced in those 46, okay, and why they've ended up saying what they're saying. Now, it's been quite useful as part of the wider lit review that underpins the Just Neighbourhood research, as to go far and wide and to look elsewhere beyond UK, and to discover, of course, that it's the US that has been talking about equity and justice for more extensively and to a greater degree than has been the case in the UK. I think there are a lot of people talking about justice right now, but if you go back over a longer time frame, it's been a much bigger issue. And equity planning tends to be more or less a substitutable term for planning for justice in that wider literature from North America. But I just wanted to pick out this little quote from Low and Kim's paper, where they themselves had been looking at content and the way in which plans in the US, in this case I think it was Michigan they looked at, and they were saying that most plans don't talk about equity, don't include many goals or recommendations that would advance equity, read justice, but plans with stronger public participation processes do seem to have a greater equity orientation. And for us, that's been very, very useful in terms of helping us as a hook, almost a kind of a jump-off point for a lot of what we're doing in the Just Neighbourhoods project. And I think this is important because others. Susan Feinstein, for example, is an example here. Who's written at length about social justice and planning, and I quote that she talks about how social justice should be the yardstick for institutions. That should be the primary, or at least one of the primary measures for what we do and what we seek to achieve. At the moment, we use growth in this country, and it gives us an entirely different perspective on what's important and how our decisions and what trade-offs and how we weight trade-offs in planning at the moment. And I think that's really problematic, personally. So I just wanted to also, otherwise I forget, I want to acknowledge the wider research team. So not just myself working on just neighbourhoods, I'm working with Tessa Lynn, John Sturzaker and Matt Wargent on this. So I just wanted to kind of say that, and also that what I'm saying now and the arguments that I'm putting together, they're not necessarily a view of the whole team. This is me making these comments, and also for omissions about what we're doing in the project. So, as I say, the research itself is looking beyond just England. So we've actually done content analysis in the first phase of more than 100 plans in areas that are objectively defined as top 20% at least on the IMD. And even in England, very few tackle head-on the kind of issues that the IMD indicators show up for those areas. Again, the work is ongoing, but is this because communities themselves aren't aware? Is it because they're being persuaded away from writing about those things? Is it because they feel that putting those things into plans sends out a negative image of place, and they want to project a positive image? I think all of that is possible, but the argument I want to put forward for tonight, at least, is that I think that is really problematic in terms of trying to reorientate or reclaim the space for social justice that I think planning should be occupying. If we're developing a dominant culture in planning that either allows or encourages that kind of content to be omitted or ignored, then I think that is a false step. And the argument I'm making is not that this is going to fix everything, but I'm making the argument that unless we do this, it's even more difficult to justify shifting the dial towards a social justice agenda than we have now. So, where am I? Yeah, so the same authors, so Lowe and Kim also go on to say that, and this is kind of reflective now of what's happening, say, at local government level, certainly in the US. The impression that local government officials are not aware of or interested in identifying vulnerable populations, even though they exist in even generally affluent areas, comes through in the research. So what I'm trying to say is, unless we recognise and press home the issues of deprivation, issues of social justice, via and through very local or hyper-local planning, then to what extent can we believe, trust, or otherwise imagine that planners at local authority level or central government officials are going to do that job for us? The evidence would indicate that that doesn't happen. So, I've become pretty strongly of the view that identifying and inscribing those kind of issues at this kind of scale becomes an important component to try to mobilise and move those issues up. So to follow justice upwards, or to pursue justice upwards, to coin that kind of phrase. And so the kind of theoretical base for the project is really rooted in work by people like Sen and Lake about, situated justice, if people in the room are familiar with that kind of work. And the argument is that justice is worked out also, in a piecemeal way, in a fragmented way, but it also through processes of deliberation, processes of consideration in planning. So, I'm asserting then that, I think that even formal plans should reflect the kind of issues and matters that are actually important to areas of deprivation, rather than assuming them away into some other place, some other strategy, someone else's concern. And I think we see this. I think that it's all too easy to say, no, this is land use planning, it's just about this thing. Okay. I think more responsibility needs to be now taken, particularly in the current environment, for what we write, what we decide not to write, where we write it, both at the hyper-local scale, but then further up into local plans. That evidence theme again, what kind of evidence is actually being used, what evidence is being commissioned and fed into local plans in the first place, I think is an important question. There's a whole load of work, and it's interesting actually as an aside, I suspect there's been more research and more papers written about neighbourhood planning in the past 12, 13 years than there hasn't been about local plans. Why is that? Crazy, I think. And so there's an agenda, and I'm kind of inviting those of you who are active researchers in the room to be thinking about, actually, maybe we do need to do a bit more on the more mundane, in-your-face aspects of planning system and planning framework than we've been used to doing in the past. Because unless we take that on and carry that through, and hold a mirror up really to what's missing in plans as well as what's in plans, then I think that is also an issue. I also forgot entirely to put a clock in front of me, and I haven't got a watch. So can anyone tell me how long I've been speaking for, and then I'll know?
50 minutes.
Huh?
50 minutes.
I've been speaking for 50 minutes? Oh, God. Have I really? I did this thinking it was going to help, and I get on my high horse. And all right, okay. Well, maybe I'll move forward slightly then. I'll just kind of try to move into it's light theory. So I'm taking a slight risk, but it's light theory. This argument I'm trying to put together about inscribing, what we might say, inscribing justice, right? About actually recognising and holding up problems and issues. I think is really important if we're expecting issues of social justice to be taken up in policy, then we need to make sure that they are visible. And we need to make sure that they're visible at the very local scale. And so some of you may be familiar with this Kingdon's multiple streams model that simply argues that, problems have to be recognised in the policy stream and the policy stream. They have to come together for action to actually be taken. If they remain separate, or any of those streams are disconnected with each other, then you won't get implementation, you won't get action. So I'm maybe not explaining that as well as I might, because now I've realised I've been speaking for 50 minutes. But the argument is that the hyperlocal level can pick up on and promote the problem stream and put it into the policy stream. And once it's there, then at the very least, there's a better chance for the political stream to pick up on it. Now, maybe it's a forlorn hope, but that certainly is the kind of argument I want to put forward tonight, and Kingdon's model just helps just a little bit with that. So I'm just going to have to kind of move forward a bit into the future then, the future bit of what I'm talking about. So bear with me. So I've kind of tried to say a bit about the past through that lens of parish planning, and a bit about neighbourhood planning, and then a bit about what we're trying to achieve through just neighbourhoods, which, as I say, is try to argue for what we're calling inscriptive justice. Yeah, a stepping point, a first step along the way to actually insisting that what happens in our policy making, our plan making at very local and local level do actually explicitly talk about social justice and explicitly talk about what measures, what decisions, what aspects of what we seek to deliver through plans relate to that agenda. That's the kind of past present bit. The future bit, well, of course, when you start talking about the future, it's bound to get a bit fuzzier. But what we do know, of course, is while the 2010 government brought in Big Society and the Localism Act we talked about, we're seeing now some similarities and some divergences, of course. Some of the similarities are, back in 2010-11, we had a wide and deep public sector austerity agenda. We had, a drive to promote growth. These things haven't gone away. If anything, there's been a doubling down, certainly on the growth agenda. So you might argue there's a kind of a similar-ish context to where we were back in 2010, 2011. But after the election, 18 months ago, there was an immediate kind of flurry of announcements, certainly about growth and planning reform. And some of you may or may not remember, but the very first week of the government being elected, Rachel Reeves, in her first speech on the steps of the Treasury, was talking about growth, and in the second breath, planning reform. Okay, so she was very clear. That's a strong message here, kind of thing, isn't it? She was very clear about that the planning needed to be reformed to enable growth, and so it shouldn't be any news to any of us in the room that unless planning, how can I put this? Unless some changes and quite fundamental changes are made, then planning at the moment is being orientated simply to facilitate that. I'm quite disappointed with the Labour government, should we say, for the kind of approach that they're adopting. And I was watching very carefully. There was a gap. There was a bit of an eerie silence after May 2024 in relationship to neighbourhoods and neighbourhood scale. And so I was kind of waiting to see what was going to happen there. A few months later, the soft kind of or very quiet announcement about funding for neighbourhood planning, formal neighbourhood planning was to be dropped, came out. My own view on that is that the funding itself should always have been better targeted. Think about the number of plans being produced in more deprived neighbourhoods where they arguably might have actually had a greater benefit for those communities with the right support. I think that was a problem. Some have talked about the version of localism that neighbourhood planning represented was a kind of a sink or swim kind of version. And so I wasn't entirely surprised when government had neighbourhood planning support programme in its sights, but to be quite frank, it was very, very small amount of money. And my own view is that money could have been redirected and applied to the areas that I've been talking about tonight. And there's some hope that the raft of announcements that have now come out post April 2025 is that in amongst that money that's been talked about, that there is space still for neighbourhood planning to play a role, or a neighbourhood planning 2.0 at least to play a role. But if I just skip back a little bit, because by the end of the summer of 2024, although government didn't want to admit to it, they oversaw the introduction of the ICON. Some of you may be aware of the ICON Independent Commission on Neighbourhoods, which started its work just over a year ago now. And although it was supposedly independent, it's quite clear at the outset that it had a very, very, it was operating in very close proximity to government. And in the past 12 months, they've produced a whole flurry of reports. And if you are interested in neighbourhood stuff, then you might well have already seen some of their material. And if not, then I'd recommend that you do have a look, because at the very least what they've done is go back through and be pretty thorough with the evidence base about particularly disadvantaged areas, deprived neighbours, left behind areas, even now in the language of ICON, mission critical neighbourhoods. And so they've been trying to kind of set out the characteristics and help to inform government policy in relation to targeting and thinking about renewed kind of neighbourhood policy and neighbourhood renewal policy, let alone planning. So the word planning, and this happens a lot, doesn't it? The word planning gets used in a lazy way in policy, and you see announcements and reports writing about planning, and sometimes it's quite difficult to discern if they're talking about narrow and statutory land use planning, or they're talking about something a bit wider, something that might sit more alongside, say, parish planning and community-led planning kind of activity. But it was interesting that just a few months ago, so this is July 2025, ICON made this argument: moving forward, regeneration policy must prioritise neighbourhood level planning and delivery as a key lever for achieving the 613 mission critical neighbourhoods I don't know, I must be misquoting this, because what they're arguing is that neighbourhood level planning is critical to assisting those 613 mission critical neighbourhoods. And they go on to argue that the neighbourhood is spatially small enough to appropriately target resources and engagement, but large enough to be able to generate positive feedback loops and so on and so on. So there's some very interesting kind of thinking coming out of ICON that seems to chime and resonate with how I'm thinking and what I'm arguing tonight. And by the way, the final report of the ICON Commission is due in, I think, about 2 weeks' time. So kind of watch that space. So if I go back then to what's been happening alongside that, the governmental announcements, I'm sure some of you have picked up on back in the spring of this year, the initial announcement on plan for neighbourhoods, and they announced that they were going to put about £1.5 billion towards 75 of the most, in quotes, doubly disadvantaged areas in their terms, in government's terms, that is, ranked by highest deprivation levels and the weakest social infrastructure. But also that those areas were going to be managed by neighbourhood boards, and this is back to some of the issues with missing a trick. As far as I can work out, neighbourhood boards are nothing more than an old-fashioned kind of partnership where a representative from the community sits alongside the local authority and various other local actors, and lo and behold, it's pretty much the local authorities maybe very cynical now, but pre-arranged agenda is rolled forward, this is where I think we're really missing a trick. That if ICON are arguing that we do need neighbourhood level planning, and government are prepared to concede that there does need to be at least some kind of representation in terms of shaping policy and decision making via things like plan for neighbourhoods, then why not relook at that neighbourhood planning model and reintroduce and embrace some of the lessons we've learned, I think, from exercises like parish planning in the past. So that wasn't the end of it, of course, because only last month the Pride in Place programme was announced, and the Pride in Place programme kind of wraps together the plan for neighbourhoods, claiming £5 billion of funding over 10 years to support 250 places of the type we've just talked about, and the kind of target scale is about populations of about 10,000, so more or less in that neighbourhood scale. So the Pride in Place approach itself, according to government, is supposed to bring local people into decisions that shape their neighbourhood, and again, targeting pockets of deprivation. And in quotes, we're also going further to put community involvement at the heart of the programme, and we'll be working with neighbourhoods to understand the best ways to engage citizens and root each plan in communities. The problem is that at the moment, there is no detail about how that will be affected. So I guess what I'm saying for those of you who have been interested in neighbourhood planning or neighbourhood scale planning activity, is game on. And I think that people like myself and others in the room and beyond, there is an opportunity to be making the case very, very stridently into government about how that actually needs to be operationalised. And also how we need to make sure that issues are actually written down that reflect a social justice agenda rather than the same old kinds of project-based work that we've seen from neighbourhood renewal type activity in the past. Now, Ben, how long have I really been speaking for now?
An hour and 5.
So I'm really going to have to kind of wrap it up, because I was also going to talk about the civil society covenant, but I'll just cut to chase and just do a couple of minutes by way of conclusion. Then, where does it actually leave us, and where does this leave this? The view I'm trying to put forward to you about planning at scale and making a positive difference. I think that planning needs to be socially accountable, and we need to assert some of these kinds of lines back into discourse. And the social accountability thing links to what actually are we talking about, what actually are we inscribing in policy and in plans. And I think that participatory planning can help here. And I think that the kinds of issues that we're faced with now, so I'll just go forward, is planning now inhabiting a space where there are a lot of fairly irrational kinds of responses towards planned outcomes, and irrational responses to a whole series of issues, whether it be housing more generally, towards so-called woke agendas that are perceived to be elitist, or indeed now even a relationship between the immigration issue, housing and planning. And one of the images there is the recent kind of furore over the hotel in Epping, which also had a direct connection with land use planning system. So at the moment we're in a situation where the kind of rhetoric and claims that are being nurtured and amplified by populist politicians are bleeding over into the mainstream. They're bleeding over into mainstream planning. And we need to be really mindful of that. And I think we need to start reckoning with that. So I think the stakes are quite high. They're higher than they may have been in the past, both in terms of omitting social justice opportunities and credentials, but also now how planning itself could easily become a vehicle for intolerance and a container for the dark side of planning. So I'm going to start finishing up now, and it is quite a dark kind of note to finish, but I promised I'd kind of try and make that distinction about politics of planning and planning politics, and simply expressed, one is about the politics within and the nature of politics within the system, and one is, if you like, the wider politics in which planning sits. So if planning politics is also about the healthy debate about options, then we also need to be aware of the politics of the populist right and how that could be used to divide and alienate. And I think that concluding point reaches well beyond the scope of what I'm talking about, neighbourhood planning. But at the same time, I think that the neighbourhood scale can both foment this kind of politics, but also that progressive deliberative planning at the hyperlocal scale can also help us overcome it. Now, maybe that's a bit of an overreach to say that, but I'm trying to find something hopeful to say about the possible potentials of, of good deliberative planning to actually help people understand issues and local issues more carefully and more thoughtfully than the kind of more knee-jerk and divisive kinds of responses to issues at very local scale that are being seen and flaring up all around the country as we speak. So that's not a very cheery note, really, to draw to a close, but I'm going to draw to a close. There's nothing cheery really on that slide, except what I did when I was playing around yesterday. Is I thought, well, how can I find something? So something that's a bit more upbeat. If you really want to, you can scan the QR code, and I put together a little playlist that resonates to an extent with what I've spoken about today for your commute back home. So that's where I'll stop, and I'm really sorry I've overrun so horribly. Okay.
Great, thank you very much, Gavin. So we do have time now for some questions. So I'll bring this microphone round. If anyone has questions, if you can just speak into the microphone, it just helps make sure that we capture your question. Any questions? We'll start here and then.
Hi Gavin, and really enjoyed your presentation and very much share your concerns about populism and the far right. Something that has perhaps slipped under the radar quite a lot is local government reform. So these big changes to many of our councils, particularly in England, where many local authorities are being combined into kind of super authorities. That's causing quite a lot of paralysis at the local level. So teams being caught up with reform rather than actually working for their communities. But also these much bigger local authorities and how communities are going to relate to having fewer councillors, much bigger areas. And I guess what that says for neighbourhood planning. So how can neighbourhoods relate to these much bigger authorities? And that all seems to be happening a bit below the radar. So there isn't a lot of public debate about these very significant reforms to our local democratic structures.
Yeah, no, good question. I should have said at the end that AI is entirely wrong about 5,400 words taking 45 minutes. But anyway, no, the bit I cut out was really about the Civic Society Covenant and also the Devo Bill and the promise in the Devolution Bill about effective neighbourhood governance. And again, that's another thing to still up in the air and to play for, because, what do we mean? Every one of those three words needs to be challenged and thought about and pushed back at local authority level. What a local authority is going to conceive as being neighbourhood and effective and governance. And I think there are some pretty obvious opportunities to reclaim and rehabilitate things like neighbourhood planning in that kind of space. So I think there is a gap opening up, and indeed we only have to look at some of the struggles that previous, if you like, consolidation and reform of local government has left us with. So some of the big counties, some of the big rural counties, and how they're managing what they're doing. They haven't saved any money, by the way. A lot of them are those ones are the ones that are really struggling financially, and they've also struggled to kind of create any form of effective neighbourhood governance that I can see. So there are lessons, and there is a lack of, again, it's the evidence theme. There kind of seems to be a lack of a proper kind of feedback loop here in terms of the evidence of prior reforms and change in relation to that particular question, but also more widely about what we know about planning and its effectiveness and its value.
I don't know if this is on. Oh, it is on. Lovely. Sort of linked to the previous point, just going back to what you were saying about sort of vertical linkage between different like local authorities down to parish councils and up to these new mayoral and county combined authorities. Through incentivising parish level to become more active in terms of social justice, I was wondering if you could talk about the effects that might have on the different democratic mandates that different sort of levels or tiers of authorities might have? Because as someone who works in local government, I know there's often a bit of a tension sometimes between, for example, like a local plan for the unitary authority that I work in, for example, the local plan, and the neighbourhood plans that our parish councils have, that sometimes kind of almost go exactly against what the local plan says, for example. So I'm just wondering if you're not asking for a solution, but commenting on it.
These are some of the, I mean, certain things, I believe it or not, even though I overran, there's lots of things I didn't actually say that are in here. And one of the things I was saying is about how a lot of local authorities have found neighbourhood planning, to be frank, an irritant, in a context of being, under-resourced and so on and so forth. And that let's take that as read. But more generally, one of the issues we haven't been able to tackle is the sequencing question for a start. Yeah, and playing with how you could actually be working on neighbourhood planning either just in advance or alongside local plan making. Or whether or not certain parts or elements of what one does at neighbourhood scale and local scale should be better coordinated. So I think for that to happen, there does need to be a greater willingness on the part of local authorities. And so Kat Salter, who's worked with me in the past, she did a PhD specifically on local government responses to neighbourhood planning, and found that there's a really mixed picture. There were some very supportive and some less supportive and some that were pretty much dead set against neighbourhood planning. And the thing is, I fully understand why some local authorities have been either passive or against neighbourhood planning as it was organised, as it was delimited. But my argument is, I think we can reclaim it and make it much, much better, rather than abandon it. And it needs to be supplemented with things that we tried even further back in time, if that's the general message of what I was attempting to spin for you tonight.
Thank you, Gavin. I'm actually going to connect to your last point. So my question relates to, I find it interesting, that you brought in populism and Reform UK, and I certainly think that planning has a role in that. But why do you think it's neighbour planning when actually, if we look at the areas where Reform has won seats or the projection of the voting patterns, actually, if we don't solve the structural inequalities that we've got, then those are exactly the neighbourhoods that are against planning, they are against regulations or, there's an anti-local plan kind of movement in many of the locations.
No, I've got it. I've absolutely got it. I understand where you're coming from. And again, in retrospect, I should have probably just spoken about the Just Neighbourhoods project, okay? Because then I could have given you a bit more detail. But we're working with neighbourhoods in Middlesbrough, for example, and what you've just said is patently not true when you actually start talking and working with them. Yeah, and this is what a lot of what this argument is resting on, is that actually they want people to work with them, enable them, and to guarantee a degree of voice. Yeah, there is something about the process of planning, slightly wider, not the imposed narrowness of neighbourhood planning, that I think is very, very useful. And I'm worried that the Pride in Place programme and the institutional arrangements that are yet to be fixed could well be missing a lot of this important and useful understanding that we've managed to kind of draw together in the past 20 years. So I kind of push back slightly about that assumption that actually, and this is why I wanted to do the work, to actually spend time with neighbourhoods. And we've spent a year and a half with a suite of neighbourhoods of this type. We're not ready to kind of fully reveal and report on the project. We're still ongoing, but certainly those are the indicators. And also other neighbourhoods we've worked with, they if they don't get involved in things like neighbourhood planning or similar mechanisms elsewhere, it's because they've got a direct line to, and they're using a more clientelistic type of approach or a direct lobby approach that they've just found more effective, but only effective in a very uncoordinated sense. It's just, it's money for a project here or money for a building there or, upgrading a bit of open space there. It's not in any sense tackling very often more deep-rooted kind of questions, and that's what I'm saying about the social justice thing. Actually, step number one, recognise and inscribe it. Don't let it be lost.
Thanks, Gavin, and thanks for showing us the old UCL logo on your card. That's because UCL is about to rebrand again. So anyone with a card, keep it and use it in the future. Do
that. Yeah.
It's good to see that. Just take a step back a little bit, Gavin, for a moment. I think I was interested in how you finished the talk on the right. You seem to be assuming that the critique of planning is coming from the extreme right. But to me, some of the most interesting critiques of the planning system are coming from the centre-left. And I felt that in your talk, you rather dismissed what the Labour government is doing simply because they talk about growth. But there's nothing philosophically wrong with growth. It's about equity and growth, as you did imply later. And so I suppose the question I'd have back is, at the moment, people on the left are arguing that you need more abundance. You need more growth. I've been reading Klein and Thompson's book about the US planning system. I find it hard to disagree with their critique of the trade-offs around regulation, the way in which powerful groups use regulation to control land use for their own ends, and the damage that the lack of growth is doing to poorer communities. I find that a powerful challenge to some of what we know. So it's a wider question, really. Is growth antithetical to what good planning is about in Britain? Because I think you implied that in the talk.
Yeah, I don't mean that.
But you didn't critique what the Labour government is saying. It's not just about growth. They're arguing that you need some type of bottom-up development in communities and neighbourhoods to challenge reform. That the reason reform is so strong is that it's picking up on left-behind places. So I don't think their argument is rip up planning to allow any type of growth to happen anywhere at any time. I don't see it as a form of neoliberalism. So I just wondered if you agree with me. You may disagree with that, but
I think I might. I think I might disagree with the last point. I don't disagree with the idea, though, that there is such a thing as good growth. But I think the argument I'm trying to make, or making in the frame of what I'm talking about today, is that growth has been used as an excuse to excuse almost anything. Yeah, and excuse away other considerations. I think I'll just leave it like that. Yeah, but there we are. I knew when I spoke today it would provoke questions because I decided not to go into a lot of detail on a lot of things. So, yeah, okay.
Thanks for a great talk. Can I ask you what seems to be the thorniest issue I've picked up from the gap in the devolution bill about what sort of structures there should be? There's some bodies representing town and parish councils like NAUC saying, we've got them, we can just use them again and invent something similar for urban areas. Other people say, well, actually, these are really unrepresentative. They don't represent communities, we need something new. But back to the vertical point, if you're going to have much bigger local authorities, don't you need some sort of institution that's accountable rather than just a group of people coming up to do a plan and then disappearing?
Yeah. Well, of course, it's always sensible, I think, to try at least to build from what you've got. And I think in other work we've done certainly on neighbourhood planning, in urban areas, the institution of neighbourhood forums was seen as a very positive thing because prior to that there'd been kind of nothing, at least. So I think part of the game is to think about how one can, how can I put this? Democratise neighbourhood forums, yeah? Because, of course, when they were set up under the guidance of Localism Act, it was just 21 people who were supposed to represent the neighbourhood. Now, I think that most people would argue that would be a deficient, model for democracy in the long term. But I do think that the very institution of the neighbourhood forum was seen as a positive good, even without the production of a neighbourhood plan, because it was a rallying point for communities and views that otherwise were not being captured either by local authorities or as a locus and a place for discussions to be had between, say, a community perspective and developers. So I suppose in a roundabout way, I'm saying let's not, speaking a bit back to Mike's point, what I'm saying is let's try to learn and keep some of the things that we've developed in the past 14 years, but rehabilitate them and make them fitter for purpose than they have been up until now. Otherwise, what's happening instead is just being swept away, and I think that's a bit of a problem. It's a problem when you get down at a very community scale, very community kind of level, because people get more and more worn out and burnt out. Right? What we've spent 10 years on this, and it's just been swept away. So I think there's something in that as well. It's real people. It's their own time and their own energy. And we've written about some of the moral and ethical dimensions of the overuse of voluntarism. But if voluntarism, if it's then ditched, all that kind of sunk effort just ditched, I think that's also adds another level of for me that's problematic.
Last question.
Thank you. I enjoyed this very much and learned a lot because it's not my subject and I don't study it, so it's really educational for me. I especially enjoyed your insistence from your work on parish plans that the process of deliberation, the process of engagement with each other as the citizens of a parish was the important thing, out of which much more subtle and sophisticated perspectives would emerge than simply YIMBY or NIMBY kind of points of view. So that was great, and I look forward to reading it. The comment I can't resist to comment on this growth issue. I mean, I think one of the reasons why there is so much hostility to this espousal of growth at any cost at the moment is that the UK is, I think, in the OECD, the only country which has managed to have growing GDP per capita and static wages. Somebody is getting the benefit of the growth, but it is not the working population. So no wonder there is criticism. So that's just, in a way, a comment to Mike. I mean, I wanted to ask you a question, which is about something you didn't actually mention, which is the equality impact assessment business.
Well, I've actually got in here that I wanted to reassert social impact rather than it be subsumed and hidden within wider assessment, but actually bring that to the fore and make that something that cannot be elided in the way it has. That's actually part of what I prepared, which clearly would have taken 2 hours to have explained.
I mean, it's a fantastic vehicle for people in local authorities, whether it's councillors or officers or neighbourhood people, to really explore inequalities and their character and nature and mechanisms and devise plans to respond to those conditions. But have you ever seen it done? I haven't. Certainly not in City Hall in London, where it's been a complete shambles.
Yeah. Can I just go back to the growth thing, because I think it is an interesting one. I think for me, and how I was, albeit in a clumsy way, was simply say that the way in which growth has been positioned in relationship to planning, i.e. market housing, is a real issue. So it is the real problem. So I'm not really talking about per se growth in a wider sense, economic growth per se, but the way in which growth has been linked pretty much directly and in a very blunt way with large-scale private sector housing delivery. That's I think is where I'm at.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to stop the formal questions there. Gavin, thank you so much. Obviously, a huge amount of material you didn't even get through.
Yeah, there's an experiment I'm not going to...
Huge amount of material we did have.